Okay, we should be good.
All right. For those of you that are joining us today, welcome to Pathroot. This is our live stream series called The Family Guide to Addiction. My name is Carolyn, and today I'm joined by two wonderful people that I've known for quite a bit of time. Stella, raise your hand, and Paige. And the topic that we're going to tackle today is the ripple effect of addiction on the family. So all three of us on this live stream have experienced addiction with one or more of our family members. And we want to talk about how that impacted our family, not only us, but others. And then focus a little bit on if we knew then what we know today, are there some decisions that we made that might have changed and been a little bit different? So, Stella, I'm going to start with you. Why don't you just give us a quick introduction of who you are, anything you want to share about yourself or where you're joining from, and then we'll move over to Paige.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Well, my name is Stella, and I'm a longtime friend of Carolyn's and also a business associate. We've done a couple of businesses together, but more importantly, we've shared a lot of information and a lot of pain and a lot of stress together about our adult daughter addicts. I'm the mother of two children. I have a 35-year-old daughter who is not an addict, and I have a 40-year-old daughter who is an addict and has been an addict for many, many years.
All right. And also just to add to what Stella said, Stella has been a very successful business owner. She's had a long time career in the conferencing and collaboration industry. So one of the pioneers of that particular industry. So what you're experiencing today with Zoom, Stella did all that stuff before it was cool to do Zoom. If we only knew about Zoom, we would have created it a long time ago. And Paige, again, Paige and Stella and I all know each other. So Paige, just share a little bit about who you are and what your background is.
So I live, in Georgia. I met Stella and Carolyn. We lived in the same neighborhood. I have three children. My situation and my story isn't really about my children. It's about my brother. Right now, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I have kind of a second act going now with in the mortgage business, and that's me.
Yeah. So if I need
and animal rescue.
That's right. I was going to say, I can't believe you would have left that out. I was going to say, if I have a friend that needs to get advice and get a loan for a house, they come to Paige. And she also helps with an organization called Angels Among Us that goes and transports, or you're still running the transport side, right, Paige?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when they need to take dogs out of these kill shelters, Paige makes sure that they get out, and this organization finds foster moms and dads to house the dogs. How many dogs do you have right now, Paige? Just out of curiosity.
Just two right now. I foster failed on my recent foster. She was a good addition to the family, so I'm at two where my husband likes for me to stay.
Yeah. All right. So sharing a little bit about my story. My adult daughter, as Stella referenced, was addicted for 15 years. Unfortunately, I lost her to overdose when she was 29 years old. That's been about 6.5 years ago. And I was married to someone from my hometown. He had a massive struggle with alcoholism, ultimately lost just about everything in his life, his home, our marriage, a second marriage, a third girlfriend, a job, and ultimately shot and killed himself about 10 years ago. So in my primary family, which we started as 4 of us, now there's only 2 of us that have survived addiction. My son, fortunately, is not addicted. He's successfully married to a nurse and we have 1 grandchild. So So all three of us, between the three of us, we have quite a bit of experience on what happens with addiction. So Stella, I'm going to pivot back over to you because we really want to talk about how your daughter's addiction impacted the people around you in the family. You mentioned your 35-year-old daughter and others. Walk us through some of the challenges that your family faced because of your daughter's ongoing addiction.
Okay. Yeah, let me just give you a brief history about my daughter. She was prescribed a cough medicine with codeine from having bronchitis early in high school. And she quickly discovered that she liked the way that made her feel. So then she started stealing opiates from medicine cabinets, mine, her friends' parents. We all had Percocet from going to the dentist. And I had absolutely zero knowledge about addiction. I did take her to a doctor when she started experiencing hair loss and weight loss. And the doctor's reply was it was a lifestyle issue, and I had absolutely no clue what that meant. So that still left me in the dark. He didn't come right out and say, your daughter's addicted to opiates. So it was not till later that I really found out what was going on when she actually came to me for help at the age of about 19. And we started to go down the path of one treatment center after the other. And each time she would go to a treatment center, she would come out and she would relapse, and we would, start the cycle all over. But one of the things that I think that I sort of overlooked at the time was how this was impacting my younger daughter, who's very private, by the way, and she would never really share the impact. But myself looking back, I feel like that probably for a good 10 years or longer, I neglected my younger daughter, not in the sense that I didn't love her just as much, but, she was the one that always had her act together, went to college, got her master's, very successful. She's a successful young mother today. And I spent all those years focusing on trying to save my other daughter that I think I really neglected her. And I think there was probably deep down, there's some, I wouldn't say resentment. I think she's mature enough to understand. But looking back, I wish that I had not focused every ounce of my time and energy trying to save my oldest daughter. So there was I believe, a big impact. She chose to pack up and move to Italy for 5 years. I know she had a love of Italy, but I think deep down, I think she possibly was running away as well, not wanting to have to deal with the family dynamics of all of the drama that came with having an addicted child. So that was one way. It also impacted, obviously, me, spending thousands and thousands of, dollars trying to save her, not realizing that most of that was just going to be futile because most of these treatment centers are short term. And what I know now is that doesn't work. It takes a very long, in most cases, a very long term treatment. So everything that I was trying to do wasn't really working, and hasn't worked to this day. So it had a huge impact on me for a long time. I couldn't sleep at night, the worry, until at some point I just had to resign myself that there were some things that were not in my control and were not going to be in my control, so that I could, start leading a healthier life myself and focus on me and the rest of my family. So
Yeah,
that's a big.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that because I'm gonna dovetail some comments on what you said that are parallel to what I've experienced. But I want to move over to Paige, because I imagine that, if you're in Stella's position or my position and it's your son or daughter that's addicted, you may have a little more control or influence because, you might control them legally if they're under 18, or certainly that there's a different dynamic. But you shared that this was not one of your children. By the way, Paige has 3 awesome children.
Thank you.
and some grandchildren. But how does that dynamic shift, Paige, when it's not your son or daughter and it's your brother? What's the impact on your family?
Well, so I'm the oldest. My brother's 3 years younger than me, and my father died of a heart attack when I was 13 and my brother was 10. And so I always, maybe that's what made me a control freak. I always felt like I had to look after him. And so my mother, I think what happens with people, especially families, is really the first idea that you have or knowledge that you have about addiction or alcoholism or whatever is with a family member. So you have no experience with it. You don't know how to handle it. So I started thinking that I could control it and I could make him well, just be the big sister. And I think all three of us, my mother and me and my brother, we all had our different versions of what my brother's alcoholism looked like and was he even an alcoholic. And so we just had different approaches. And early on, I heard somebody say, really before we realized he was an alcoholic, that alcoholism tears families apart. And I honestly didn't, I was like, well, how could that happen? And then when my brother became an alcoholic and we were all having our different approaches, I saw how it tears families apart, and it tore us apart for years.
So tell me why it tore you apart. Was it because all your philosophies were different, the way you would approach the problem, or what was going on in the family?
Yes. So, like I said, I'm a bit of a control freak, but I'm also somewhat of a joiner. So when we figured out what was happening with my brother, I went to alcohol. I went to oh my gosh,
Al-Anon.
thank you. I was about to say. And it was a great group. I loved it. I learned so much in there. And that's when I learned about my, third meeting. Oh, I can't fix this. And I can let it go. It was starting to impact my children, my husband. I was running over to my brother's house all the time. My mother, on the other hand, went to Al-Anon, and she's not a joiner. And she just thought everybody there was a bunch of whiners, and she left. And so my mother, I think because it was her child, she just wanted to take care of him. I had a hard time talking her into sending him to rehab. And then after probably 2 years when nothing worked, I realized that I had let go and distanced myself some because it was my brother and it was easier and he was grown, but my mother could not do that. So our approaches were just so different that my mother and I got to a point where we couldn't really speak. And then, kind of like Stella was talking about, I felt like, well, do you love him more than me? Because you don't want to come to my child's birthday party because my brother's not there, and it was just the dynamics, things that you thought about when you were a child or that maybe you never thought about, I think come to the surface. And I think it depends on who it is, what member of the family, what birth order, as to what's going to happen. But it was such friction that it took years for it to be repaired. And finally, my mother did realize that she had to stop enabling him. And that is how he finally got sober.
So it sounds like just, this is probably common to a lot of families where somebody wants to support and put a safety net out there. And what you've learned in Al-Anon says that may be even though it seems like the right idea, it may be counterintuitive to what helps that person actually take responsibility for themselves. So my experience is more similar to Stella's. I came from a town that there wasn't alcohol at all in my town. It was a dry county. So we had to go 40 miles round trip just to go to the liquor store. So I had absolutely no education about alcoholism. I had a very small nuclear family. It wasn't an issue in my family, not part of my experience. So the first kind of contact I had with somebody struggling with alcoholism was my husband, who went from social drinking to drinking all the time. And I knew something was radically wrong. I just didn't know what the something was and how to be helpful. So a big regret I have is, and my way I managed it is I got a divorce, which is probably not the healthy thing to do, is to run away. But when my daughter started experimenting with drugs, actually, Paige, you were one of the individuals in my neighborhood that confronted me about it. You got a group of our friends together, told me what was going on. And then I realized, boy, I better educate myself really quickly. Put her in therapy. That didn't work so well because she was really good at manipulating the therapist. And ultimately, when she got completely out of control and a danger to herself, I started putting her in programs. And same way that Stella recalled, she looked really good in these programs, but she would come out and she would relapse pretty often. And I wafted between putting the safety net under her, because, I wanted to check the box of making sure she was still alive, but I never put the check in the box of being a good recovery partner to enable her to take responsibility for herself and try and recover. And the impact on our family was pretty doggone devastating. I had just remarried. All of this started to fall apart the very first year of my marriage. So it was a huge burden on my new husband, who was there trying to protect me from what was going on. My son, who was older than my daughter, she was incredibly hard on him, so much so that she actually called the police and vented a story that he had attacked her, which was not true, had him put in jail because he was 18 at the time. So it was just like completely disruptive for him. And much in the same way, Stella, you did. I spent all my time trying to work with her to the detriment of ignoring him, and not really paying enough attention to him. So I think that made a big impact. And I want to mention one other group of people that it made an impact on, and that was my mother and father. So when I would travel in business, they would come stay with the kids, and they weren't any match for Laura, because she would sneak out and she would get into trouble, and they just couldn't manage her. And we come from a small southern town, so I'm pretty sure they were relatively humiliated by, what she'd become. Everybody else is bragging on their grandchildren, and here we have Laura, who's in and out of treatment all the time. So it's really kind of hard to keep up with that. So all three of us kind of like, it all impacted our family. Fortunately, it did not destroy my family, but it could have very easily ruined my second marriage. Fortunately, my son was able to recover from that because he had a really good friend group. But I don't know that I was really the best parent or partner for him with where he was with his sister. And I think it ruined his relationship with her forever. So when she passed away, he was not in a position to really be helpful. So Stella, going back to you, one thing I'd like to kind of focus on, if you could replay the tape, knowing today what you know about addiction and alcoholism, and if you could go back and rewind and do anything differently, what would be something that you would do and change based on your current experience?
Yeah, probably a couple things. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have probably insisted that I immediately take my daughter out of the current high school that she's in, probably send her pretty far away to some type of a wilderness camp. And then I probably actually would have moved, and where she would have had a totally different school, different network of friends. One of the issues I had was that I had gotten divorced when she was 10 years old, which I think had a very big impact on her. Plus, she also came from a family of addicts. My brother was an opiate addict. Her uncle is an opiate addict. So she got a little double dose of genetics combined with some adverse childhood experiences, which one of them was the divorce, which I think at the age she was highly impactful. But in my divorce arrangement, I shared, I had physical custody of her, but when it came to medical decisions, I shared joint custody with her father. And I remember even at the time that we put her into counseling when I realized there was a more serious issue, they recommended that we send her off, and I could not convince him to do that. He thought it was just a teenage rebellious. So if I had it to do over again, though, I would have pushed harder. I would have maybe gotten legal involved, where I could have, maybe gotten that decision overturned, where I could have sent her away. Because I think sometimes catching it early and really changing their environment could be a big help. That would be one thing I would have changed. I definitely would have paid a lot more attention to her friends, her network of friends. I mean, if it took hiring a PI to follow her everywhere she went, I would have done it, because you turn a blind eye and then you don't even know where they are. So that would have been something. And I think I was in a little bit of denial stage too, not wanting to believe that she was out doing these things. So I think deep down I kind of just sort of poured myself into other things instead of really focusing on the core issue. But I didn't know. So I can't carry that guilt with me forever. The second thing I would have done was a little bit more, again, as I mentioned, more of a balance of the household. I think I was probably pretty unfair to my youngest daughter, because she was busy trying to be the strong one and the good one, because she just naturally was, while I was focusing every ounce of my energy on my oldest daughter. And I don't think I would do that again. I think that was just not really fair to her. And I'm proud to say that I think she weathered that storm, because she's just a very strong individual. But I could have lost her in the process, because I think that sometimes the other children that are sort of kicked aside don't fare well. I got very lucky there.
Yeah,
So
good
those
advice.
are two things I would have done differently.
Yeah, good advice for the people that are listening in. Paige, what about you? If knowing what you know today and as much work as you've done in Al-Anon, you could go back in time, how could you have helped not fracture the family? What would you have done differently?
I think, again, my brother was an adult, and so it's different. I think I would have known a lot sooner what I was dealing with, and realized that there's nothing I could do to fix it. I would have disengaged sooner and tried to keep myself calm about the situation, and realized that it wasn't about me, and it wasn't my fault. And I would have probably tried to just remain calm and be more understanding of my mother and the choices that she was making, because I think my reaction to so much of this is just added to the rift in the family. Whereas if I knew what I know now, I probably just could have been more understanding and just let it go.
Yeah, I mean, I think what both of you guys are pointing out is what I see to be a huge issue, where one person is participating in Al-Anon and has educated themselves, or one person's really kind of in the forefront of the fight, and the other person that needs to collaborate is not on the same page. So perhaps, trying to find a different way to educate the whole group, or maybe even put the whole group into some kind of counseling, would at least get everybody on the same page. Because if you're not unified, what does an addict typically do when you're not unified? Stella, what do they do when you're not unified?
Well, they're going to manipulate you by going to the other person in the family.
Yeah, they're going to go to the one that they feel like they can get something from. And so like whatever planned process that you're engaged with is not going to work out, because they're going to split what's happening. For me, I think what I would have done is, number one, I would have educated myself all about the disease of addiction, because I really just didn't understand it. it never crossed my mind. It was never, something that was part of my experience. So I think I would have tried to get an intellectual understanding because, from my perspective, it was a behavioral issue. Like I couldn't understand why either my first husband or my daughter were doing what they were doing. I didn't understand the brain science or the compulsion. Stella, I agree with you. I would have balanced my efforts with my son against what I was doing with my daughter so that we weren't just so completely out of balance. And I think the third thing, and this is going to be kind of a harsh statement, is I would have recognized the broken system that I think treatment found itself in. That you go to 30 days of rehab, the programs were structured very similarly, but when they came out of rehab, there was no kind of structured follow-up to keep them connected to a good recovery process. So I didn't understand the value. What I did was if one program didn't work and we got relapse, I would just try something different. I just go to the next program over. But
I did the same.
It was always
To the tune of about 10 of them.
Yeah, exactly. So Paige, knowing that there are families that are listening and looking for advice from this conversation, what would be one last piece of advice that you should give them before we wrap up today?
I think the education piece is really important, and so that the family can try to stay on the same page. And if you have one family member that isn't, you just have to try to understand where they're coming from and not get in arguments with them. Because I think it's really important to be as unified as possible in dealing with it, in dealing with, your addict or alcoholic. They need to see that the family is unified and even thinking they all agree that you are an addict, you are an alcoholic, and they all sort of agree on how they're going to handle it to the extent you can, but never let yourself get into fractured relationships with the rest of the family. It's not worth it.
Good advice. Stella, what about you? What's one last piece of advice that you'd like to share with the families that are listening?
Well, gosh, if we had about 2 hours, there would be quite a bit. Because,
we'll come back and do another one.
I've learned so much through the years. But I guess the one thing I want to say is that if you are dealing with this today, you are, in a way, you were way ahead of the game than where I was 20 years ago. There's so much out there in terms of, as Paige said, in terms of being able to educate yourself. There's so many more resources, and we still have a long way to go, and we know that. But there are many, many, many more resources today than there was at the time that I discovered that my daughter was an addict. So I would definitely take advantage of educate yourself. And then the last thing is, and I guess I've been preaching this to others and to also myself over the last 20 years, and have to remind myself daily that, every family meeting that I went to, they always said, remember the 3 C's. And people say, well, what are the 3 C's? Well, the 3 C's are that, you didn't cause it. You can't, what's the other one, Carolyn? You can't control it.
Yeah.
There's many of them. You didn't cause it. You can't, and you can't control it for sure. So, you have to, you can't change it. There's actually a lot of C's there, but you have to remember that, and you have to tell yourself that daily, because you really can't control it. You cannot control them, but you can control what you do and how you process things.
Yeah.
So I would definitely keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's all great advice. I think this has been an interesting conversation because a lot of people, there's a lot of resource often focused on the addict, but not the family. And so for those of you that are listening on the call, you can, and if you're watching this on the Pathroot platform, you can sign up to Pathroot for free, and you should jump inside of the learning centers. There's 6 of them available to you that talks about what is addiction, what's the brain science, what are your treatment options, what's going on in the family with the dynamics and how to address those. So they're very topical, and use this content in there to elevate your education. I think you heard that from Stella, Paige, and me, that's really kind of critical. And, keep looking at the live streams, because we're sharing stories from our own personal experience, and hopefully you'll find that helpful, or perhaps, it addresses a challenge that you're facing. So I appreciate Stella and Paige for joining and sharing their stories. And this again was the Pathroot live stream, the Family Guide to Addiction. So thank you and enjoy
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.